Welcome to episode 47 of the Non-Fungibles podcast. Today we're peeling back the layers of one of blockchain's most pressing debates with our guest, Joe Waite. Joe brings a unique blend of philosophy and crypto to the table, offering us a rare glimpse into the heart of Ethereum's struggle with censorship resistance. We navigate through the murky waters of the Tornado Cash incident, discussing the delicate balance between privacy and regulation, and what this means for the future of DeFi. Joe also sheds light on the centralization risks of MEV pools, the impact of real-world assets like USDC, and the potential dire consequences of major financial instruments on Bitcoin's ecosystem. And for fun at the end, we also announce the next Non-Fungibles creative writing competition. I think this episode sets the scene for further conversations on a level that we haven't really explored publicly before. We hope you find it as impactful and thought-provoking as we did. Enjoy.
With a non-fun gerbils, come on now, non-fun with a gerbils. We interview founders and builders with the focus on the tech and the fundamentals. George and Luke have been friends since they were kids. We collaborate with the audience to make scarce, dank, creative gerbils. Rude moose is a force to be reckoned with. With a non-fun gerbils.
So, Joe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We've really been looking forward to this. So just for context, we've got George here in the room and we've got Candy in the room.
Hello.
And today we're going to be discussing your thesis primarily, which is on censorship resistance within blockchains, or specifically Ethereum. But I know that you have a lot of opinions and views around the broader ecosystem and that dip into Bitcoin as well. So yeah, I mean, you work for Superchain, but we might circle back to that a bit later, but this isn't specifically on Superchain. But yeah, I mean, maybe you could start by an introduction to who you are and your background, and then we can go on to the sort of premise of this whole thing.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Joe Waite, and I'm currently working as a project manager for Superchain. My background academically, I actually studied philosophy, was my academic background at the University of Manchester. I'm from Manchester in England, born and raised. I went to university here, and yeah, I did a philosophy master's degree there. That's really my first passion. But books of Plato and Aristotle don't offer much sustenance, and alas, a man must eat. So I went into software project management, worked on some large digital transformation programs, and in 2021, I got very interested in cryptocurrency. I'd known about it before then. I'd followed the topic of Bitcoin mostly from a kind of political or economic angle, and I was quite interested in it, but never something that I got personally involved with. Around 2021, someone introduced Ethereum to me, and I basically used to argue with them from a skeptical point of view and try and pick holes in why this idea will never work, why the government will just shut it down. So I think from early doors, I was thinking about how this could be censored or how the powers that be might control this. But after going back and forth, I eventually became convinced, no, there is definitely something to this. It seems like quite a resilient technology. And as soon as that transformation happened in my mind, I became really interested in the subject, started devouring anything that I could to try and learn more. Once I read everything I could find online, read a bunch of books, I wanted to find out more. And at the time, I'd actually moved to Cyprus to work on a large project there. And just so happened that University of Nicosia also had an MSc program in blockchain and digital currency. So it fit with my interests, and I joined that program. That lasted about a year or so, and towards the end is when I wrote my thesis, which is titled Towards an Evaluation of Ethereum's Censorship Resistance. And that's how I got interested in this topic.
So we had a discussion about this. I met you in London 3 weeks ago, something like that.
Yeah.
The contents of your thesis kind of blew my mind, and the depth of your knowledge in the area. Can you give us an overview of what you were looking at with that, and then the sort of overall findings that came from it?
Yeah, so I think it's worth just explaining the genesis of this thesis and why I came to this topic, first of all. My original thesis proposal had a completely different title, which was, What is the Value of Decentralization? So there's this blockchain trilemma that I think Vitalik wrote an article about it, and it's much discussed in literature. The idea that there is some tension between decentralization, security, and scalability in blockchain. And it's a kind of, pick two. You can't optimize all of these three properties simultaneously. You're going to have some trade-offs in the architecture of your blockchain. And for me, it was decentralization that's the most novel and interesting aspect of blockchain as a technology. The other two prongs of that trilemma, security and scalability, these are things that we're familiar with from existing technologies. And I think we have fairly well-developed mental models for thinking about security or thinking about scalability. And it's quite clear to people what the value of those things are. But decentralization, which is this novel property of blockchains, it's not so clear to me what the value of that is. And if you say to someone, hey, why don't you trade off this thing that clearly has value and is very tangible, like scalability or security, for this thing that is like less well understood and kind of intangible, and I can't clearly tell you in a sentence what the benefit of it is, which is decentralization, there might be some skepticism over why would I make that trade-off. And I think as well in 2021, 22, you also saw a lot of these alternative layer one blockchains popping up. So we have Bitcoin and we have Ethereum, which are reasonably decentralized, and we'll get into that later. But then you have these other alternative layer ones that were offering much higher throughput of transactions and much lower gas fees. And in 2021, there was a lot of demand for block space, and the gas fees were very, very high. And this was very off-putting, I think, for a lot of people. And for many retail users, if you have a choice between, I want to use blockchain A, like let's say it's Ethereum, and pay $100 in gas fees to to buy an NFT, or I'm going to use blockchain B and I'll pay less than a cent in gas fees to do the same thing. As a retail user, it seems obvious that I want to go with blockchain B, and it's not that clear. Why would I pay this huge premium to use this decentralized network? So that was the context, but I clearly felt that there was something very important about decentralization. In fact, that's what made me the most bullish about Bitcoin and Ethereum, was that they had that decentralized network. But I think it needed to be properly articulated. What is the value of this? And the conclusions that I came to was it's something like a similar way of thinking about it is insurance, or cybersecurity, or security in general. These are categories of things where there are mitigation against some tail risk, some low probability event that has a high impact. And the problem with these things is they require quite a high investment, and you don't need them until you do. You see this with big enterprise software companies they don't invest properly in cybersecurity because, of course, they want to optimize for like shareholder profits in the near term. Then they get a big hack and they lose all of that revenue. And suddenly now they're very keen to invest in cybersecurity. So it's a similar thing in that the benefits that we get from it are less tangible. I was developing this thesis proposal along these lines, but I found it quite difficult to say something that was very concrete about the topic, something that I could do some deep research on and actually quantify. And then during the course of writing the proposal, Tornado Cash got blacklisted by OFAC. We can talk about that later, but that struck me as, wow, here is clear as day a great example of what is the value of decentralization and what are the pitfalls of centralization. And I also felt like for blockchain cryptocurrency, this was a historic moment, and it was something that I really wanted to document. There was so much going on at that time, and I thought, wow, this really sets an important precedent. Someone needs to collect up all of these details and document it.
Well, that's perfect timing then. Just happened to be when you're really searching for the thing to deep dive on, and then it's presented to you on a plate in a meaningful way and an impactful way. Let's talk about that. So can you give us an overview of what happened with Tornado Cash, what was implemented, and what the outcomes were?
Okay, yeah. So for context, Tornado Cash is an obfuscation tool. It is a way that people on the Ethereum network can obfuscate a connection between two addresses. And what do I mean by that? Everything on Ethereum sits on a public ledger, and it's very difficult to hide anything, and it's very easy to trace the source of funds. All you need to do is track where the transaction came from and who it's going to, and you can keep tracing it back and back to its source. Often the source will be a centralized exchange, some sort of on-ramp that someone has had to convert their fiat currency to cryptocurrency in the first place. And you can't really trace beyond that. If you're law enforcement, you could go to the centralized exchange and subpoena them for their records, and you can find out who was behind that address. But for anyone just looking on the chain, usually that's where the trail stops. So you might not necessarily be able to trace someone's personal identity, but you can still trace funds back to their pseudonymous identity, to their wallet address. So if I want to have a brand new wallet that's freshly funded, and I don't want anyone to be able to associate the funds that are in that wallet with the funds that are in my main wallet, then I need a way of sending money to that new wallet that can't be traced on the blockchain. Now, there's two ways of doing this. One way, if you're not concerned about law enforcement tracing you, one method I would suggest is that you send the funds to a centralized exchange and withdraw them to a new wallet. Anyone looking at the chain will see, okay, the funds disappear off to an exchange, you can't trace it beyond that, and then they magically appear in another wallet. It's not a completely resilient method, but that's one method. Another one is you use some sort of mixing protocol or something that is going to, in a kind of mathematical way, decrease the probability that someone can trace funds from A to B. And Tornado Cash was one very popular DApp, a decentralized application, that people use to do this. The way that it works is people are depositing funds of some fixed increment, so like 1 ETH or 10 ETH or 100 ETH. It has to be some rounded amount. Let's say all four of us all deposit 1 ETH. You see the transactions going in. Then there's a withdrawal out. Now the question is, whose Ethereum is it? So just from tracing the chain, you can't be certain. Now, if it's only 4 of us who've put funds in, then there's a 25% chance about who it is. The more people that are putting their funds in, the larger the anonymity set is, and mathematically, the lower the probability that you can identify who those funds came from. It's also the case that the longer you keep the funds in there, then the lower the probability you can know who it is. If you just deposit funds straight away and then withdraw them, then someone could say, well, that's probably you. So that's a bit of context about Tornado Cash and what it does. Tornado Cash, like any encryption or obfuscation technology, or any technology generally, can be used for different purposes. Okay? So if you are a hacker and you've hacked someone's wallet and you want to make off with those funds, you would probably send them to Tornado Cash and then they disappear. Nobody can trace where they go after that. So that might be a criminal use case for Tornado Cash. But people have a right to privacy. People don't want to be identified on chain. I wouldn't necessarily want the whole world knowing how much funds I have and being able to follow every single transaction I make. So basic privacy is another reason why someone might want to use Tornado Cash. Another common use case for Tornado Cash is actually people deploying smart contracts for new protocols. So lots of the popular dApps and protocols that are on chain, their contracts were deployed by a wallet that was funded from Tornado Cash. And it makes sense as well, because if you hold the keys to a protocol that has hundreds of millions of dollars of locked value, you don't want people to know your identity. So that's a very rational reason to want to use something like Tornado Cash.
It's that relationship between security and privacy, and how they're intertwined. One leads to the other.
Yeah, and the concerns that law enforcement and the state has around a tool like Tornado Cash is that criminals and adversarial states can use this for some malicious purpose or some purpose that they don't agree with. Generally, governments, the powers that be, they like to be able to control things. And this is an example of a technology that puts transactions outside of their control. And I think that's disconcerting. So what happened was the Office for Financial Asset Control, this is OFAC, which is a US government body, they announced that they were putting Tornado Cash onto the blacklist. Now, what's interesting is Tornado Cash is not an entity. It's not a person. It's not an organization. It's a series of smart contracts. And smart contracts are just autonomously executing code that lives on a blockchain. So this in itself is completely unprecedented. Sanctions previous to this have only ever been applied to persons and organizations that are made up of persons. If you look at the entry for Tornado Cash in the blacklist, it's completely different to the other ones that will have, the person's face and their name and their whereabouts. It just has a list of smart contract addresses. And that is what they were actually sanctioning. So philosophically, this is strange and requires some thought. Like, what does it mean to sanction a smart contract? And the idea of these smart contracts is that they are unstoppable. Now, many smart contracts, and maybe we can discuss this later, are very much stoppable because someone holds the keys and can change the smart contract, can pause the smart contract, can do whatever they want with it. In the case of Tornado Cash, the private keys that were in control of those contracts had been burned. So nobody has control over that code. It cannot be changed. It will live in perpetuity on the Ethereum ledger for as long as that ledger is being maintained by the nodes. And it executes autonomously. It doesn't require any specific actor to press a button or pull a lever. It just happens because the network is running and the code executes how everyone expects. So that is something that makes this categorically different to any previous sanctions. It's worth noting as well that the penalty for breaking these sanctions is incredibly severe. You are liable for up to 30 years imprisonment and many millions of dollars of fines. In terms of the jurisdiction as well, ostensibly this applies to US persons, right? This is US law. So I am a British citizen. In theory, these sanctions do not apply to me. But we all know that the reach of the United States is very, very wide. Also, it's not only directly interacting with Tornado Cash or supporting it in some way, it's any provision of services to a sanctioned entity is within the scope of the sanctions. And we can discuss as well, like, the knock-on effect of how that's been interpreted.
I guess as a small tangent, we could also have a brief discussion about the two Romans, Roman Storm and Roman Semenov, who built the thing. Clearly, I think your sense of reach is applicable given what's happened to those two individuals. I guess there's a double sense of giving the decentralized autonomous code community a sense of you shouldn't be doing this, or at least not in this way. And I guess the worry is that it does make people stop in their tracks, given that you can get held for, I think it was 230 days without any clear evidence either way as to what should or should not be happening to you. And also given the fact that certainly in Mr. Semenov's case, he wasn't a US citizen at all. I'd be interested just to sort of hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yes, so I don't have any specific judgment on the case itself.
Sure.
I don't know if I know enough about the detail of the case, but it is interesting that he was in Holland and is not a US citizen, and yet was arrested and, as you say, held without trial for an incredibly long period, which that is just an effect of the Dutch judicial system, which I was very shocked that is even possible. I think there might have been some confusion over how to even deal with this case. That might have led to the fact that he was being held without trial for so long, because I think when he was first picked up, it wasn't even totally clear what the charge was. Essentially, he wrote some code and deployed that code to a public blockchain and relinquished all ownership of it. No longer has the ability to do anything with that code. That code is being used maliciously in the eyes of law enforcement, and he is now responsible for that in some way. I think the case actually ended up, the angle that they went on is that he was financially benefiting from international money laundering. Right? I think that's what they ended up with. But at least in the early stage, it wasn't that clear what the charge was.
It's a fascinating case because it feels like it's the sort of the epicenter of some of the answers that we're after in terms of what it is to write decentralized code, what it is to have blockchains running unstoppable applications, and also, the desire for people to continue to produce applications. Things got a little bit more complicated. Am I right? When Ethereum miners started censoring certain transactions, and I think that's where the rabbit hole got a little bit deeper in terms of what censorship resistance means, what running mining operations means, what running a node means, and the implications of performing that function as well.
Yeah, so as I said, the sanctions, the scope of it covers any provision of services to a sanctioned entity. And that's where we get into some of the ambiguity over what does it mean to provide services to a sanctioned entity. If you run an Ethereum validator, you could be, and most probably will be, validating transactions that have come through Tornado Cash. And those transactions will not settle without you playing a role in that. So are you thereby providing some services? You're, in some sense, instrumental to making this happen, right? And I think that was the concern of some of the mining operators. So the largest mining pool, and just for context as well, we're going back to the time when Ethereum was proof of work.
Proof of work, exactly. Yeah.
So the largest mining pool at that time was Ethermine. And immediately following the announcement of sanctions, Ethermine stopped processing any transactions coming from Tornado Cash, meaning a transaction is sitting in the mempool and Ethermine is deliberately not including that in the block. For the person sending the transaction, this has this weak censorship effect. And what weak censorship means here is that transaction will still end up going through. It will still find its way onto the blockchain, but only once a non-censoring validator has picked it up. You cannot guarantee that that transaction is included in the next block, because the next block might be being proposed by Ethermine and they're not going to include it. And the reason why they're not going to include it is because they're concerned that they're going to be in some way implicated in some criminal mischief for doing so. And I think there's been a lot of collateral damage from these sanctions and what I would consider a lot of over-compliance. And I think that has brought out the kind of risk aversion of large corporate structures that are running successful businesses in this space, making a lot of money. And if you're a large corporate like that and you have a legal department, they are going to err on the side of caution. And that is going to result in overcompliance where the law is ambiguous. There is no precedent to say that an Ethereum validator is legally responsible for the transactions that they process. And at that point specifically, I think there will have to be, at some point, a precedent on this. There will have to be some kind of judgment. It's very similar to the whole idea of network neutrality. So, for example, are internet service providers legally liable for the traffic that passes through their network? we had that precedent set that no, they are not liable. If there is, someone is posting some illegal content, they're sending it to someone else, the internet service provider makes it possible that that content can be received by the other person. They are involved in the transfer, but they're not legally liable for what has passed through their network.
That's a really interesting point, because that was one of the things when the original ruling happened about Tornado Cash. It was like filling my Twitter feed with people going, all right, well, you can actually weaponize this where you can use Tornado Cash to send it to targets, and the people who are receiving the ETH, it'd be a waste of ETH to send it to somebody else, except that now are they legally liable for using the service because they've been a recipient?
So this gets us into an interesting topic, which is the topic of tainting and dusting or salting attacks. So the idea of tainting has been around for a long time in cryptocurrency, and it's the idea that funds can become associated with something criminal or associated with risk, and that risk will then carry on the blockchain. So, for example, there is some hack or some ransomware payment of Bitcoin. Those Bitcoins are identified by some compliance firms as being involved in this hack, and they become tainted. Now, if someone tries to deposit those Bitcoins onto an exchange, they can say, no, we're going to freeze those funds. This is like proceeds of crime. Because the blockchain is pseudonymous, if someone then sends those tainted coins to someone else, we don't know whether that other address is also controlled by the same entity. So for this reason, this concept of taint carries through transfers. Different chain analysis firms, I think, have different methodologies for how they measure this taint. It's not very clear, and it's deliberately not clear because they don't want you to know, hey, if I just make 8 hops with this Bitcoin, then it becomes clean again. But it can't stay tainted forever is the other problem. Because otherwise the taint ends up spreading to everyone's coins as they get mixed through circulation. So we have this idea of tainting. Now, following the OFAC ruling, funds that come out of Tornado Cash are considered tainted. So if I withdraw some funds from Tornado Cash, then I try to deposit them in a centralized exchange that has a legal entity in America, they're legally obliged to freeze those funds. The problem is, I don't decide what ends up in my wallet. Anyone can send funds. It's not like a check where I have to take it to the bank and actually cash it in. So someone can send me funds to my wallet from Tornado Cash. I have absolutely no control over that, and there's no way of me stopping someone from doing that. And then when I go to interact with some registered legal entity like an exchange, they can freeze my account. And now not only the funds that I received from Tornado Cash, but all the funds in my wallet can also be contaminated with this taint. Another problem about this is because this is all being determined by a handful of compliance firms who don't have transparent tools or methodologies. So as a user, I have no idea about the level of risk or taint of funds or addresses that I'm interacting with.
Can you imagine if dollars could be tainted and then tracked?
Well, they'd all be dirty, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's, of course, the great irony about all of this is that, cryptocurrency gets a bad rep for being used in crime and so on. But for the reasons we've discussed, it's actually not that great for funding illicit things. It's much better to just use cash. If I pass you a £10 note on the street, nobody knows about that, and there is no history of this. But what happened was, following the sanctions blacklisting, someone, maybe a couple of people, who knows who it was, but someone began doing these dusting attacks where they started sending small amounts of ether from Tornado Cash to lots and lots of addresses. These were all like very, very prominent people, people who have ENS names like big whales, founders of different protocols or exchanges. And all of those people then suffered the consequences of this. So that's part of the absurdity of the sanctions, is how do you actually enforce this in a way that's proportionate?
That's the problem with sanctions on things like Tornado Cash and applications. Where does that lead us into the sort of broader kind of topic around decentralization and censorship resistance?
Yeah, so let's think about what is the relationship between decentralization and censorship resistance. To talk about that, first, let's just be clear, what does censorship resistance mean? This has been a concept in literature about censorship and communication systems for a long time. And when we think about censorship, we typically think about it with regard to communications networks. And a classic example would be the Great Firewall of China, GFC, which controls all of the content going in and out of China. Very topical things would be like social media censorship, people's posts being taken down. You had the Twitter files. That's a very topical discussion. Within that censorship, some of it is private. So these are private companies who determine arbitrarily that they want to have a policy that allows or disallows certain things. And if your content or your communications don't match up with that policy, then you're subject to censorship. Then you have state censorship, which would be like the People's Republic of China, Great Firewall. It's an example of state censorship. Then there's this murky area between the two, which is where states will lean on private companies to enforce censorship on their behalf. And this is, I think, a growing problem and area that we should be concerned about, because increasingly our life is conducted on platforms that are owned by centralized private companies. So this was the problem of Twitter and the Twitter files, was they were exposing how Twitter executives were meeting with the Department for Homeland Security, with the FBI, with various government bodies who were basically directing censorship on the platform. Of course, Twitter is a private company. They're free to do whatever they want on their platform, but it's also become a public square that a lot of people are using the platform. So it's a concern for all of us. Then let's think about financial censorship. So as finance goes digital, these digital payment networks are communications networks. At the end of the day, it's ones and zeros being communicated across some channel. So the same kind of thinking that we would want to apply to purely communication channels begins to apply to our financial life. And that's going to be a growing concern as more and more of money and finance goes digital. If we were using cash, we would not face these problems. We've seen examples of debanking as a tool of censorship. So some very prominent events would be Trump was denied access to his bank account at Signature Bank, and the campaign itself was denied services by Strike, the payments processor. Those were entirely private policy decisions. In Canada, there was this big truckers protest, and they actually used some emergency powers legislation that is like from World War II to freeze people's bank accounts and also to freeze GoFundMe campaigns that were funding the protesters. They then started using cryptocurrency to raise money once they'd had all of their bank accounts frozen. And the government of Canada then leaned on the centralized exchanges to prevent these transfers of cryptocurrency. I think two other very prominent examples of this debanking. One would be Wikipedia. This is quite a long time ago now, but they had all of their sources of funding. All the payment processors began denying them service, and their revenue dropped by like 95%. Not Wikipedia, sorry, WikiLeaks, I should say. WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks almost had to shut down because of a lack of funding. And the recent example is the British politician Nigel Farage. He got debanked by Coutts Bank because of political reasons that they didn't want to be associated with. And this caused a great scandal in the UK. And as we move to central bank digital currencies, the ability for nation states to programmatically censor people and debank them is only going to increase. You could imagine a future where, like, we had lockdowns and only certain purchases were considered essential during that time. You go to the shop, you go to pay for something that's not essential, and your card just does not let the transfer go through. So that's the context of financial censorship. Now, censorship-resistant systems are systems that aim to function in the face of a censor who is actively trying to prevent that function. The censor is investing resources in preventing that function. And there's really two ways that a censorship-resistant system can mitigate the reach of the censor. The censor has their sphere of visibility, what they can see, because in order to censor something, you first need to know what it is that you're trying to censor. So the first task of the censor is called fingerprinting. They need to identify the thing to be censored. And the second thing is their sphere of influence. So once they have fingerprinted and identified the thing to be censored, that's the actual direct censorship, the actual preventing that function, whether it's communication or some payment. What a censorship-resistant system can do is try and put that function outside of the sphere of visibility or the sphere of influence of the censor. So, for example, encryption technology for communications, like end-to-end encryption, is very good at putting those communications outside of the sphere of visibility of the censor. They don't know what the communication is, and so they can't properly identify it. Now, one way that the censor could combat that is to just shut everything down. Like no encrypted messaging whatsoever. But that has a high degree of collateral damage. So that's a consideration for the censor. Is ideally they only want to be able to target the specific things that they're interested in censoring without causing collateral damage on things that they have no interest in censoring. They also are doing this in the context of limited resources, right? Even the United States does not have completely unlimited resources to spend on censoring things. So the more that you can increase the collateral damage that would have to be incurred in them censoring something, and the more you can increase the resources that they would have to expend in censoring something, the more difficult that thing becomes to censor. The only other piece to this puzzle is, what is the value to the censor of them censoring that thing? So if it's low value, then they're not going to spend a lot of resource on it, and they're not going to cause lots of collateral damage. But if it's very high value, then they might be willing to incur lots of collateral damage and spend a lot of resources.
That was China on the phone.
So, what a censorship-resistant system can do is basically increase the cost for the censor. And one of the best examples of a censorship-resistant system for communications networks would be Tor, the onion router. This is it's not completely without its vulnerabilities, but Tor is an effective censorship-resistant system for online communications. You can, connect to websites, even if you're under some kind of state firewall. You can communicate with people in a private way that they don't have control over. So, as it applies to a financial system, the fundamentals of it is, I want to send you money. The censor wants me to stop me from sending you the money. How can we make it as difficult as possible to the censor for them to stop that?
I mean, I suppose it raises the question to me of what was the actual value of censoring Tornado Cash to the censors? Was it actually the moving of that money, or was it a direct attack on crypto itself? What were their motivations?
Well, let's take them at face value. Ostensibly, the reason was that North Korea was using Tornado Cash to launder large amounts of money. That's what it actually says on the announcement. They pin the blame on North Korea. And we know that there is this Lazarus group, which is a hacking group that is thought to be part of the North Korean state apparatus, that had done some very high-profile hacks for many hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were laundering the money through Tornado Cash. Other nation states like Iran are also believed to be users of Tornado Cash. And I think if it was a purely criminal matter, then it might not have attracted so much attention. But because we're dealing with nation states and terrorism, then certain legislation like the Patriot Act, other kind of very wide-ranging legislation comes into play, and it becomes a much more serious matter. Whether it's an attack on crypto and decentralized technology in general, that could be one interpretation of it, right? And the precedent that it sets is to basically bring what was before then a purely digital phenomenon back into the meat space, right? And say, hey, you're a developer and you're in the Netherlands. We're actually going to physically come and find you and detain you. And this isn't just an online thing where you just write some code and it's all on the internet. This is real life, and we will find you and we will get you. Yeah, and I just want to add to this, put this in context. What is going on right now with this debate about cryptocurrency is really parallel to the debate that went on around hard encryption in the 1980s. So around that time, we had RSA, we had hard encryption, public key encryption was being developed. There's a very interesting book on this by an author called Stephen Levy. The title of the book is Crypto, and it's all about the history of RSA as a company and the development of public key encryption. But at that time, these were essentially mathematicians who were writing papers about maths, about cryptography. And the National Security Agency in America was approaching these mathematicians and saying, you cannot publish these papers. You cannot make this technology public because it's a threat to national security. And the debate at that time was, these are tools, it's a technology, and criminals, adversarial nation states like Iran will use this to advance their evil purposes. And on the other side of the debate was people saying, yes, but it's just a tool and it can be used for good or for bad. But at the end of the day, it's just a tool. What makes it more absurd as well is this is just maths. So the NSA was trying to prevent them from publishing maths or from even giving public speeches about maths. And one of their counter arguments was, like, these mathematical objects, these elliptical curves, they exist in a kind of Platonic realm where someone else can discover these. Like, a mathematician in Iran can and almost certainly will discover this. So all you're going to do by suppressing this is delaying the inevitable. Now, the preferred way of dealing with this, with the authorities, was to say, okay, we'll have some encryption, but you need to put a backdoor in it. We need to be able to access this if it's bad people doing bad stuff. But the problem with that is you either have encryption or you don't. If law enforcement, the powers that be, can get in through a backdoor, then so can a malicious actor. And the encryption is not secure. And banks, for example, were one of the key clients who wanted to use this new hard encryption technology. And they were saying, like, we will not use encryption that has a backdoor because it's not secure. Now, we have very much the same issue with crypto, right? Either it is permissionless and it's decentralized and it's censorship resistant, or it's not. And I think there is a battle for the soul of crypto as to whether it sticks to the more ideological roots of it as a very highly politicized technology, or whether certain corporate interests or, people just acting in favor of self-preservation prevails, and we end up with some sort of neutered version of what crypto might have otherwise been.
We've sort of set the scene for it, but what did you specifically investigate? And then what were your findings?
Okay, so I investigated two things. The first one was to look at Tornado Cash as a case study and see what exactly happened to Tornado Cash and what were the methods of censorship used. Just to run through some of these, their DNS, their website hosting, was all taken down. So I think the front end of Tornado Cash was being hosted by Cloudflare. Cloudflare said, we don't want to provide services to a sanctioned entity. We're taking the website down. GitHub took down their code. They actually removed all of the code repos.
Wow.
This caused a lot of confusion because, again, over compliance, it was a question of, is it breaking the law to publish code? It's quite a philosophical question, and it gets into issues of free speech. There are previous precedents to say that in America, at least, code is protected under the First Amendment. And OFAC, about a month or two later, did release a clarification saying merely republishing the code of Tornado Cash is not a sanctions violation, after which GitHub did restore their repos. It also brought up questions of, if you just redeploy the same code at a new address, is that new address also in the scope of the sanctions? And they clarified, yes, it is. It's anything that is Tornado Cash-like.
Like a smart contract. Did they scope that?
Yeah, I don't know how clearly defined that is. Again, there are very few precedents. But if you just took the exact same code and deployed it at a new address, they would consider that that new address is also in the scope of the sanctions, even if it's not specifically listed.
Sure.
It reminds me of, as you were explaining about how the US was trying to kind of censor the maths, and now we're censoring the code, as a government. It's another tool. It's the method by which people do things. And in the same case, even if it's not out there now, somebody else could do the same thing. So what an interesting cyclical nature it is of having these tools and methodologies, different formats, same outcome.
Has something taken the place of Tornado Cash? Coming back to Rude Moose's cyclical, there is this sense of potentially whack-a-mole taking place, and or has the power of OFAC been enough to shutter down the ability to mix transactions?
People who are determined to obfuscate funds from law enforcement will still use Tornado Cash.
Right.
Usage of Tornado Cash dropped immediately by 98% and has never recovered to the levels that it was at previously. So, yeah, it's worth clarifying that Tornado Cash is sanctioned and there are all of these impacts. But at the end of the day, anyone can call the smart contract. I can make a transaction through Tornado Cash right now if I want to. But the net effect of all of these different impacts is to significantly reduce usage. But again, if it's like banning firearms or banning encryption, or people who are determined to use these tools and are already operating outside of the law and have no regard for the law will continue to use these tools, and they continue to be available to them. So the main people who end up being affected by these sanctions are people who had innocent intentions, or relatively innocent intentions, let's say.
Where does that leave things like ZK rollups and that whole network?
This is a good question. It's not clear. Aztec Network is a blockchain. I think it's like a layer 1 blockchain that supports smart contracts. It's an EVM chain. And at the time, that was growing in prominence. And I'm not too sure of the exact detail, but I think that they stopped some of their operations. I don't want to claim something incorrect here, but I think that was an example of a team saying, this is hot stuff. Like, maybe let's reconsider what we're doing here. I think anything that is offering like a choice, you can choose to make your transactions private. Like Zcash, for example, allows for shielded transactions or unshielded transactions. If the ability to shield those transactions, if that's something that the devs have control over, possibly we could see developers being lent on to stop that. At the same time, having private transactions is absolutely essential for blockchain ever seeing mass adoption, right? For many, many use cases, it's essential to have privacy. So Polygon has Polygon Hermes and Polygon Nightfall. These are two zero-knowledge technologies that they have. And one of the use cases for that is large institutions like banks, or the financial institutions. They have to abide by banking secrecy laws. So they have to make transactions private. If a company is going to do a big merger, we can't have people just checking the chain and seeing, hey, look, big transactions gone from A to B. Let's try and front run something that's happening in the market. So you need privacy from a commercial point of view, but also from a retail consumer point of view. The test I would suggest is, if your wife can discover how you've been spending your money, then it's probably not money. It's probably not going to be adopted as money, because I don't think anyone is comfortable with that level of transparency about their transactions. So I see this as a very fundamental issue for crypto. This is not just like some niche thing that only hackers and pirates should be concerned about. This is really a battle for the soul of crypto and for technologies that are essential for this ever becoming money-like.
So essentially, we have a fault line. We have on one side, obviously, state powers and potentially corporate powers fighting against the obfuscation of money and private, entirely private transactions, whilst at the same time you have what I would say is the greatest computer science brains on earth working round the clock to produce technology that does fulfill that role. And then, of course, you have CBDCs in the background, which only serves to spur on that effort. Much like the hard encryption mathematicians who ended up wearing some of the code on a T-shirt, I remember,
Yep.
and there was a sort of an inevitability about that because it's maths, and this is code, and anyone can, with the requisite training and imagination, can produce this. So I'm an optimist in the sense that I feel like that fault line will eventually sort of ossify, and I feel like private money.
Oh no, we've lost George.
Oh, they got him.
Too much fire right there.
Shut it down.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on George's point, where I think he was going with this, I mean, one of the ways that the hard encryption issue resolved itself was that the knowledge just became widely distributed, and also the maths. Although I don't want to say it's simple, I certainly don't understand the inner depths of hard encryption, but it's relatively simple, right? Like these formulas, like elliptic curve cryptography, can be described fairly simply, and someone who has an advanced knowledge of mathematics will be able to understand these. So the knowledge just became very widely distributed. And at that point, the idea of having export controls on this encryption just became absurd. Like, it is in the public domain. The Bitcoin white paper is a similar example. It's a simple protocol. It's, again, simple in the sense that, okay, you probably need to understand something about computer science to really comprehend it. But there are many, many people who can understand this, re-implement it, fork it, and the Bitcoin white paper is now so widely distributed, it would be impossible to get rid of that knowledge or put export controls on that knowledge. So I think if something similar can happen with encryption protocols, that the knowledge can become very widely distributed, and that the implementation can become very, very simple. And it could be the kind of thing that anyone could run one of these encryption protocols on their phone very easily with some open source software and begin, transacting in private money. I think that is one way of getting around the censorship. But also, concerning trends, political trends, lead me to believe that governments may think that they have a second chance at obtaining a level of control that they had previously relinquished by letting hard encryption slip through the cracks, let's say.
Wow. So this is really very important and potentially quite a battle that we've got on our hands.
I could just as well tell what I think is a really nice story about cypherpunks. So for those that know, so the Bitcoin white paper comes out of this cypherpunk mailing forum. There's a mailing list, lots of different people on there trying to develop various forms of electronic cash. There were different attempts before that. This cypherpunk mailing list and other related groups were sort of libertarian or anarchist-leaning people who thought that the best way to achieve those ideological goals is through technology. And one of the symbols of the cypherpunk movement was the crossbow. So the significance of the crossbow is this is a technology that effectively ended the feudal era. Prior to the invention of the crossbow, you had fully plate-mailed knights and peasants who were like unarmored. And a few knights could control a large number of peasants. There was a complete imbalance of power between them. And that was how they were able to maintain that feudal system. And bow and arrow was not sufficiently powerful to penetrate full plate mail armor. So the tools that people had were not sufficient to address this asymmetry of power. The invention of the crossbow completely changed the power dynamic because now you could have an unarmored peasant who was equipped with a crossbow that was powerful enough to penetrate a knight's armor. And so it was a force multiplier for the unarmored peasant, and it addressed this asymmetry. And I mean, among many other things, was one of the key components that brought about the end of the feudal era. I think the Pope at the time made some remark that the crossbow will lead to the end of civilization as we know it. And in some ways it did, right? So what's nice to me about this symbol of the crossbow that the cypherpunks adopted was it embodies their belief that it's not so much political movements, like people meeting up and discussing things and going on marches, that is what really changes the political landscape, that actually technology is one of the essential drivers in the political landscape. And that technology is not a completely neutral thing, right? Like people say, guns don't kill people, people do. But a gun is specifically made for like shooting things. So these are two very conflicting views of technology itself. Is technology a completely neutral tool and it just depends on how you use it? Or are there values and consequences for society that are almost an innate part of that technology? And the cypherpunk idea is that yes, technology is not neutral, and that certain technologies can further certain values or visions of the world. And one of their famous mottos is cypherpunks write code. And they wanted to develop technology through writing code that would further their aims of increasing human freedom against a powerful state. That is the ideological genesis of a technology like Bitcoin. It was not a neutral thing that just came about as a tool. It came from a place of ideology. And I think in the early stages of the cryptocurrency as a kind of movement, this ideological element was a key component of that, but that over time, as the financial aspect of cryptocurrency has come more into the foreground, and more newcomers, people who aren't aware of this whole history and background of where the technology comes out of, have begun to be associated with this, have begun building successful companies around this. Governments are getting involved, and this kind of ideological route is getting lost, or let's say pushed into the background.
Is this an example of how power corrupts? Because you have perhaps organizations that have come in to build something ideological and become successful, hugely successful. And as soon as you're successful and you don't want to lose your seat at the top of the table, then your values change and the value becomes profit oriented rather than maybe ideologically orientated. Oh man, where are my words today? But yes. Do you think there's much of that happening here? Is this a theme?
Yes, and I think it cuts through lots of developments in blockchain, because a lot of the initial idea is that these things would become public goods. They would become these autonomous protocols that are not owned or controlled by anyone. They exist in the public domain. They provide some public benefit, and they're not extractive. You have an incentive alignment problem there, because for people to spend their time building those things, they have to do that from a place of altruism. To relinquish control over something that if you maintain control over it, could be very lucrative, could make you very powerful. First of all, why would you relinquish control over that? But secondly, why would you spend the time to build this thing in the first place? Like, if someone believes in capitalism, the idea that people who spend their time, their effort, their expertise in building something should be rewarded, and that actually financial incentives are the best way for us to motivate people to build great things. Why are we going to expect people to build great things and then relinquish all control and revenue from those things? Many of the things that are being built in blockchain charge a fee. Many of those things do not need to charge a fee. The people operating those protocols could relinquish control of them, could put them in the public domain, and make them free to use. There's an added problem here with the fact that we're dealing with software, and software is a dynamic thing. It's never static. If you have static software, it dies. So you need software to be maintained. It's not like you just build it once and then you put it in the public domain and no one has to worry about it again. You do actually need ongoing maintenance of these things. And there you have the problem of who is motivated, who is incentivized to continue to maintain those things. That's currently the argument of protocols, and why they should charge a fee is, hey, we will continue to maintain this technology, and not only maintain it, but develop it and make it better. And there are some very concrete examples like block explorers, for example. We all need block explorers. Ethereum needs a good block explorer, and Etherscan is a great block explorer. I like to use Etherscan. But Etherscan is run by a private company. They're making money from it. They could deny people service, if they're from the wrong country, or if the US government tells them you need to deny this person service. And they're not going to continue to maintain that technology and develop it further without some financial incentive. There are some open source projects to do this stuff, but they're not well funded. And often the user experience of these open source projects is just not as good as the privately run ones. So I think it comes back to very fundamental problems about incentive alignment.
That's fascinating. Oh man, we've covered so much today already. Where do we sit now with Ethereum and Bitcoin as well? Do you see any problems arising in the future?
Yes. So to flag a couple of these problems, one is around front ends. When Tornado Cash was sanctioned, sorry, it's the sensors are ringing me again. When Tornado Cash was censored, many DeFi protocols, name a few names, Aave, Uniswap, MakerDAO through its Oasis front end, implemented a form of permissioning where when you click that button that says connect your wallet, some code will run that takes your wallet address and your IP address, sends it off to a company in the United States called TRM Labs. TRM is a cryptocurrency chain analysis compliance firm. They would do checks on that wallet address and see, is it associated with risk in their database? I.e., has it interacted with Tornado Cash? If it had, then it would deny you service. It would say, sorry, your wallet is associated with risk. We're not going to let you connect to this front end. They would also send off your IP. So if you then try and connect on the same IP with a different wallet, you get the same message. Now, that's concerning because it's basically denying people access to DeFi, which is supposed to be decentralized. And people who were victims of these dusting attacks, who got sent Tornado Cash ETH, then suddenly, I think someone sent one of the co-founders of Aave Tornado Cash ETH, and he couldn't access Aave. Some of this front-end permissioning has been rolled back, but just to explain it, why does this front-end permissioning exist? Again, it's because of regulatory uncertainty. There is a concept that the smart contracts may be decentralized in the sense that they're on this public blockchain, no one has control over them, but a company, a legal entity in the United States is running the front end, and they are liable for things that happen with their front end. So what we do with front ends is one concern going forward. I think just the other day, Wallet Connect began denying services to people from Russia. And it also had some collateral damage and impacted people in Ukraine. I think they also deny service to people from Iran, Venezuela, a bunch of other countries. And I'm not just singling them out. Like, people would be surprised about how much censorship and permissioning actually exists in DeFi, as it's called. Who runs the front end? Again, it's a problem of incentive alignment. How do you incentivize people to run front ends in a decentralized way? There's been some examples of it. Liquidity would be one good example. They incentivize development of front ends. So there are many different front ends, and Liquidity themselves do not run any front end. Of course, if you're a kind of power user, you can just interact with the smart contracts directly. But the absolute majority of people are using front ends. So that would be one emerging trend, I think. Another one that I find quite concerning is real-world assets. And in fact, I wouldn't just say real-world assets. I think it's better described as non-duplicable assets, preventing forks. So just to unpack that, right? Have this concept that a blockchain can fork, and Bitcoin forked many times, Ethereum has been forked multiple times, and I think in the early days the view was always, well, if people don't like what's going on with the protocol, then people in the network can just split and we'll just have this other fork, and let the crowd decide which way they want to go. I don't think it's that simple now that you have lots of assets that you cannot duplicate. So Ethereum as an asset, if you have a fork of the Ethereum chain, now you have ETH that exists on both forks. So there's a proof of work fork of Ethereum from when the merge happened. And I had some Ethereum. Now I also have Ethereum on the proof of work chain. All of my assets got copied onto that fork. So if you had some USDC in your wallet, you also have some USDC on the proof of work Ethereum chain. But USDC is a receipt for some real world asset. And the idea is it has value because you can go to Circle with your USDC and say, I want to redeem this for US dollars. But now you have the problem that there are two sets of receipts, but there's only $1. So which receipt do they honor the redemption on? When there was the proof of work fork, Circle, some other firms that are in charge of these real world assets, essentially said, we are only going to recognize redemptions from the Ethereum mainnet. And by mainnet, they mean the proof of stake chain. So the risk I see is that as more and more real world or non-duplicable assets go on chain, it makes those in control of these real world assets the kingmakers who determine which fork is quote unquote mainnet. Because they can just say, hey, we're not going to honor redemptions. And if all of the value is in these real world assets, I mean, the whole of DeFi is reliant on USDT, USDC. So no one's going to use a chain where they're not recognized and have no value. And through that, I can see a pathway to regulatory capture.
That's a shocking realization.
Yeah, there's another angle to what is kind of the same thing around these ETFs. So people know at the moment there is a lot of hype about a possible Bitcoin ETF. And there are various filings from large financial institutions. In BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF, there is a note that explains how they will treat forks. So it says, this is what a fork is, and this is what will happen in the case of a fork. That financial instrument, the ETF, it's a security that's backed by some underlying asset. What is the asset in the case of a fork? Well, it's whatever BlackRock decides it is. Okay? And it says, we reserve the right to recognize either fork as the canonical fork, even if that is not the most widely adopted or the one that doesn't have the most value or whatever might be the case. So one of my concerns here is, firstly, people might just stop doing a lot of transactions on chain because now you can just buy and sell an ETF and you need no on-chain transaction to transfer the ownership of the ETF. And that's not great for transaction fees and Bitcoin's security model. But secondly, if a lot of the value that is in the network is coming in through these securities instruments, and the bodies that are in charge of those securities instruments retain the right to decide what is the canonical chain, again, it's this kingmaker threat. And they might be incentivized in other ways to bring these chains into regulatory compliance. So you could envisage a world where they say, look, let's get rid of all of this dark money. Let's get rid of all of this gray money that's on the chain. Let's just have a compliant fork of Bitcoin. And that is what the ETFs refer to. That will be the underlying asset. And if all of the value is bound up in these instruments, then that's what a lot of people will do. You might still get, people using the dark money Bitcoin, the OG Bitcoin. But it will largely go the way of something like Monero, that it just gets pushed into this kind of underworld thing where you can't really cash out, you can't really use it for everyday transactions. So this is like far-flung science fiction stuff, but I do think it's worth thinking about.
I feel like the more time goes on, the less far-flung the science fiction turns out to be, though.
Yeah.
Just to add one last emerging trend that is probably the most concerning and was the most concerning finding from my research is about the role of validators in censorship. So without going into too much detail, there is this whole block space supply chain that has been created through economic necessity, I guess, where there is a division of labor in the production of blocks. So you have block builders who build the blocks. The block builders pass on those blocks to relays, and the relays then send the most profitable blocks to the validators. So in the original vision for a chain like Ethereum, the validators are both building the blocks and proposing them. But the current state of play is that most of the validators are not building their blocks. That's being done by some other specialized group of people. They build the blocks, pass them on through the relays to the validators, and the validators just propose them. Now, these relays, Flashbots would be the most well-used relay and probably the most well-known relay as well. They are, for the most part, registered legal entities residing in some jurisdiction, typically the United States. And they have to meet compliance. So they don't want to be associated with relaying sanctioned transactions. So the relays implement censorship blacklists and will not pick up transactions from, let's say, Tornado Cash. Now, because they are now passing on the blocks with the transactions that ultimately end up on the chain, this ends up censoring those transactions. They don't get proposed by the validators. So when we talk about decentralization, we need to look at it very holistically. You might have a network with tens of thousands of validators, but if all of those validators are getting their blocks from relays, and there is only a handful of relays, I believe at the moment there are 4 relays, and they are responsible for around 90% of the traffic in Ethereum. Now, as a government, as a censor, if you want to censor that network, you only need to throttle those 4 entities. You don't have to worry about going out to each one of the 10,000 validators. You just control the flow of traffic in this very tight funnel. Now, this MEV block supply chain is becoming incredibly lucrative, and there is a trend emerging that is called vertical integration. This is something that is like very standard in microeconomics, in any large corporate structure. A very famous book about it called The Theory of the Firm, that at a certain point, it becomes worth it to integrate other aspects of the supply chain into your business. So if you make cars and you consume, a lot of, let's say you're Tesla and you consume a lot of lithium, it becomes worth it for you to actually own the lithium mines, right? And there is a similar trend in this MEV supply chain where you're getting the people who are doing the MEV, they're actually extracting the value, the people who are building the blocks, and the validators all becoming one and the same entity. And that is a very corrosive, centralizing trend that is motivated by people following clear economic incentives. And what's very corrosive about it, I think, is that the idea of blockchain originally is that it relies on what's called mechanism design, which is like a subfield of game theory. And the idea is you can create these mechanisms where people following what is in their individual personal self-interest can promote some kind of noble goal that's of public benefit to us all. It's a kind of Adam Smith invisible hand of the market theory, right? And these blockchain systems are designed to operate in a maximally adversarial environment where your assumption is everyone is totally narrowly self-interested in their own profit and completely adversarial to everyone else, and yet the system works. It doesn't run on fumes. It doesn't run on goodwill. It runs on people pursuing their narrow self-interest, and that is what is supposedly so great about these systems and makes them so resilient. The problem is the centralizing effects that we see in the block supply chain are the direct result of people just following those narrow economic incentives. And it seems like to do the altruistic thing would be to not be a part of that supply chain and not connect to relays that censor transactions. To do that, you will reduce your revenue as a validator. And I don't think we can expect people to do that if we want these to be resilient systems.
And there's the bombshell. So, is there a way out of this? Is this fixable?
The question of is there a way out? Is it fixable? I don't think it's ever going to be a done deal. This is a story that continues to go on, and we never close the book. We can see this with the story of encryption. The UK at the moment has just passed an online harms bill that essentially outlaws end-to-end encryption. End-to-end encryption messaging providers like Signal have said that they will just vacate the United Kingdom rather than comply with this legislation and break their encryption. So that's an example of something where, we might have thought that the battle was won back in the 80s, but it's ongoing and it's reared its head again, and it's a never-ending struggle. And ultimately, these are human problems. These are social problems. These things enter into the meat space. To a degree, they are technological problems, but the solution relies on flesh and blood human beings and their values and their decisions. And that's why in my research, whilst I looked at every level of the technology stack and what censorship vulnerabilities there were, the most fundamental base layer is the social layer. And it is ultimately the people who govern and develop these protocols are the ones who will determine the future of them. And those are real flesh and blood humans with lives and concerns.
Yeah. And does that incorporate everyone that uses it and all of those people as well? Or in terms of having an impact on that? Just everyone?
In some sense, everyone who is a user is a stakeholder, including people who aren't a user. I mean, you could never use Signal in your life, and you're a stakeholder in them being effectively outlawed from the United Kingdom, because this has a chilling effect. Like journalists, whistleblowers, politicians are regular users of Signal. And my own personal view is that we need these capabilities to have a free and open society. So even if you are not a direct user of these technologies, you are a stakeholder in this issue. On the other hand, think about the Bitcoin network. Holders of Bitcoin, users of the network, have no power over its governance. Mining pools have power over the governance of the Bitcoin protocol. Bitcoin core devs have power over it. But you as a coin holder have no real sway.
Yeah, fascinating.
I think, unfortunately, we are way over time, but it's been totally worth it. I think we might need to do another episode on this, if you'll come back, and we'll continue the conversation. These are very important things to think about. and to address. And it's not just within crypto economic systems. It is a global theme at the moment.
I would be more than happy to come back and discuss this. I think there is a lot that we didn't cover. And I only have to hope that the censors will let me discuss this topic further.
Yes. Well, we'll stick it on IPFS. Is that how censorship resistant is that?
Yeah. In the end, with Tornado Cash, they ended up hosting the front end on IPFS using an ENS domain. Called a smart contract on Ethereum. Not giving anyone advice, not telling anyone how to use Tornado Cash, just as a disclaimer. But that was the solution.
That's the plan then. Yeah, until ENS is blacklisted.
Yeah, and Tornado Cash is probably the only example now of an application that I think deserves the name DApp. If your DApp is running on Cloudflare, on a DNS host, and your team has the private keys to change the protocol, and you're in charge of the ongoing maintenance and development of it, I don't really know if that is a decentralized application.
Joe, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us.
Definitely looking forward to the part 2 and the conversations that will come from this one. Oh my goodness.
Hey, there's a lot we can talk about. And aside from that, I'm working at Superchain. We're dealing with on-chain data all the time. And we get a lot of very interesting insights out of the chain that, I'd be interested to discuss at another time.
Well, there we go. There's part 2 on its way. Brilliant. Thank you. Right. Well, we'll see where this goes. And I'll see you next time. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. That was so interesting.
Wow, Rude Moose.
Yes. What an episode.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
That guy's a legend.
He is. I didn't think I would be so excited about hearing about censorship and things relating to it, but here we are, and now we're ready to have more, I think.
Definitely. But in the meantime, we have a gerbil to announce, right?
Absolutely, we do. And how appropriate indeed. We are ready for our community to tweet us your stories for Censored Gerbil. And as always, we will make our favorite story into art, mint it, and send it to everyone who has sent in an entry, even if yours isn't the chosen winner. This gerbil will be in collaboration with Hugh Views, who will be creating a gerbil through embroidery. And how exciting is that? And Luke, if you want to tell us a little bit more about the embroidery gerbil.
Well, this is certainly the first gerbil that has been created through embroidery. Hugh Views is an excellent artist, and she's an awesome person. So it's an honor to be doing this collaboration with her. So as well as a set for everyone, there will also be a one-of-one version of the NFT, and that one will come with the original. But that one will be available on auction, most likely. So it's whoever wants the original can go and bid for that. So yeah, send in your stories, and we're looking for you to paint a picture with your words.
Oh, how exciting. I'm looking forward to this, especially being a censored gerbil. What kind of a picture can we paint?
There's so many directions that this could go in, right?
Yes.
Very thematic for the world today.
Indeed. I'm looking forward to the entries for sure. And we will have those open until Sunday, November 12th. So make sure to tweet us your entries at nonfungerbil with the hashtag censoredgerbil in the story.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Rude Moose. See you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure as always.
With enough fun, gerbils, come on now. With enough fun, with a gerbil. We interview founders and builders with the focus on the tech and the fundamentals. George and Luke have been friends since they were kids. We collaborate with the audience to make scarce tech create Joe.